Hey, what is up guys, Murderman4 here, and today I'm going to be continuing my look back at the modern series of Doctor Who with Series 2. Now, it's undeniable that Series 1 was a major success, but especially with a brand new Doctor so soon, the question is, was that just a fluke? Well, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we can safely say it wasn't, but I do think most people would agree that Series 2 is not quite as beloved. It's a sentiment that I share, but as I haven't seen most of these episodes for the better part of a decade, perhaps I'm in for a surprise. So, why don't we take a look back at Series 2. It's interesting watching this series in hindsight, since David Tennant is now so ingrained in the role of the Doctor that he's even played multiple incarnations. But this is when he was fresh to the role, and the new series had to prove that not only could Doctor Who work in the modern day, but that it could survive a regeneration so soon into its success. Tennant was clearly the right man for the job, quickly winning over the hearts of those missing Eccleston, and eventually becoming the only Doctor to really rival Tom Baker's claim as the definitive Doctor in the minds of the general public. While his debut season may not be as solid as his predecessors, Tennant himself was an unquestionable success. So let's start at the beginning of this legacy with the Christmas invasion. The Christmas invasion marks the beginning of a long-standing tradition of having a special episode of Doctor Who over the holidays, with this one doubling as David Tennant's debut as the Doctor. As far as Christmas specials go, I'm honestly kind of mixed on how this is integrated. On the one hand, I do think the ideas of the robot Santas and the killer Christmas tree are a lot of fun, but at the same time, they just kind of feel here for the sake of it, like an excuse for padding out the runtime and justifying the Christmas Day transmission. I mean, it's not that big a deal, since like I said, it is fun. I just think it feels a little too forced, and I prefer the way Christmas is just used as more of a background dressing as in the rest of the episode. Especially since the Sycorax make for a much more interesting threat. There's actually a great deal of tension drawn from Earth receiving their first transmission and their approach towards the planet, and their ability to control everyone with A-positive blood to make their threats is an interesting invasion tactic. Plus, for just a cool design. And David Tennant? Man, what an entrance. Yes, he spends a good chunk of this episode unconscious, but that makes his ultimate arrival in the climax, ready to defeat the monsters, that much more satisfying. Tennant instantly steals the show. He's charming, he's witty, but he's also unpredictable and quietly ferocious. His confrontation with the Sycorax is great, but it's his confrontation with Harriet Jones that really leaves an impression, after he lets the Sycorax go in peace and she commands their slaughter. The Doctor has rarely been more terrifying than his threat to bring down her government in a mere 6 words, and you just know this incarnation is not one to mess around with. So, on the whole, I think there's a lot to like here, but it does kind of take a bit to really get going. So I'm going to be giving the Christmas Invasion a 7.5 out of 10. Well, it was nice while it lasted. New Earth is the first new series story that I straight up don't like. Firstly, I don't know if it's just me, but was Cassandra a villain really deserving of a comeback? I mean, she did the job in the end of the world, but I don't know, I just feel like there's not that much to her. And while the body swapping gimmick has its moments, I do find it pretty hit and miss. And while I do actually really like the ending, with Cassandra unbeknownst to her past self becoming the final person to call her beautiful, it doesn't really feel earned, with her being incredibly selfish throughout the entire story and refusing to accept death, until suddenly she's perfectly fine with it and all's well. The actual hospital aspect of the story is better, with the concept of them secretly growing clones whose sole purpose is to be lab rats for incurable diseases having lots of potential. But the fact that so much of the story is spent on Cassandra means that we never get to dive too deeply into it, and the fact that every clone is infected with every disease, and that they can all be instantly healed by a mixture of every cure simply being sprayed on them, does strain the suspension of disbelief a tad too much. It's not awful, but there's definitely more bad than good here, so I'll be giving New Earth a 4 out of 10. I don't really have much to say about Tooth and Claw. I think the werewolf is handled quite effectively, as the story does a pretty good job of building tension and making the kills feel brutal, despite not actually being able to show anything graphic. I also like that it isn't just a mindless creature, it has an actual goal to infect the Queen in order to create its own empire, which makes the stakes just a little bit higher. I also think the story does a good job of showcasing Torchwood's genesis and foreshadowing what's to come. I'm less keen on the Doctor and Rose's dynamic, which is beginning to have a few obnoxious traits. It's not overwhelming, but I definitely wish it was dialed back a bit. But yeah, that's it really. It's a pretty entertaining episode. In fact, I enjoyed it more than I remembered, but there's not all that much to it, so I've settled on a 7 out of 10. Isn't it just lovely to see Sarah Jane Smith again? Even as a kid, before I'd seen any classic Who, I could just feel how momentous this was. While this wasn't the first time a prior companion had made a return appearance to the show, it was the first time we got to properly explore the aftermath of their departure, and while this has now happened several times in recent years, this undoubtedly remains the best example of it. David Tennant perfectly encapsulates the shock and joy and pride of seeing his old friend again, and the scene where Sarah realizes his identity never fails to give me chills. It's great too to pair Sarah up with Rose, where there's an initial amount of jealousy and resistance that ultimately grows into a bond of great respect, as Rose realizes, even if she isn't the first like she thought, that doesn't make her relationship with the Doctor any less special. Of course, I also have to mention K9, who's a joy to see again, and Mickey is brilliant here, with his realization that he's effectively the Doctor and Rose's K9, which drives him to want to prove himself more and ultimately ask to join them on their travels. Honestly, looking at the character work from the last few years of the show, it's astounding to me that all of this is contained within a single 45-minute package, and it's so good. Although I do think it's to its advantage that it's a mid-season episode rather than a big-scale finale with so much else already going on. Of course, I haven't really talked much about the story itself, which is rather overshadowed by Sarah Jane stuff, but is still perfectly good in its own right. I love the setting of the school, the Krilltanes are decent monsters, and Anthony Head is absolutely superb as the menacing Mr. Finch. It's just a thoroughly enjoyable story all around, so I'll be giving School Reunion a very firm 8 out of 10. Stephen Moffat has a knack for instantly intriguing premises, and The Girl in the Fireplace is no exception. When not on modern-day Earth, most Doctor Who stories are either spacey or historical, but this episode decides to slam the two together, so we get robots from the 51st century stalking a woman from the 18th. I really like the idea of the time windows. The ability to step through someone's entire life in an instant is both fascinating and depressing. On the one hand, it's fun looking in on Renette at different points in her life, but on the other, without the ability to control which time period they arrive in, it sets the Doctor up for tragedy. As the Doctor and Renette's relationship grows throughout the episode, perhaps a bit too quickly, but it just about works, it all builds towards the gut punch of an ending where the Doctor finally invites her on board the TARDIS, only to return too late. Minutes for him became years for her, and the Doctor discovers she passed away in his absence. Now, as someone who typically doesn't care for the Doctor being a romantic figure, while I don't love that angle here, I appreciate that, for the Doctor's part, he is relatively restrained, and this being the ultimate payoff, makes it well worth it anyway. Renette aside, I love the idea of the clockwork robots. They're a fantastic design, and the idea of repair droids resorting to using body parts of the crew as replacement parts is wonderfully gruesome. I also enjoy the mystery that's teased throughout the episode as to why they're specifically after Renette, and I think it's great that the Doctor, Rose, and Mickey never discover the answer. But in the final shots before the credits roll, we see the name of the ship, SS Madame de Pompadour. It's a very satisfying final twist for a very satisfying episode, so The Girl in the Fireplace earns an 8 out of 10 from me. Historically, the Cybermen are a pretty hit-and-miss monster. Thankfully, for me, their new series debut is one of the hits. Now, I was a few years late to the new series, so I don't know what the reaction was at the time, but in hindsight at least, I think it was a great move to introduce them via a parallel universe. Not only do we get to explore a Cyberman origin story without needing to worry much about existing lore, but it gives complete freedom for the stakes to be as high as possible. This isn't our world, so anything can happen. I also love just how well the story captures the horror of the Cybermen. A lot of Cybermen stories just turn them into stompy robots, and sure, we do have that here, but there's also a strong emphasis on conversion in a way that the TV series only really tackles a couple other times. The story is also brilliantly shot, holding back on revealing the Cybermen in full until the climax in Part 1. Graham Harper remains one of the show's best directors, and it's easy to see why the new series brought him back. Elsewhere, the parallel universe aspect lends to a lot of great drama for both Rose and Mickey. For the former, because she discovers her dad is still alive here, and the latter, because Mickey is starting to become disillusioned in his own life and relationships, and is looking for something more. I think both of these aspects are handled really well. It's great setup for what's to come later in the season, and a satisfying culmination of Mickey's character arc as he finally finds the strength for independence, choosing to stay here rather than return home with the Doctor and Rose. He may have been a short-lived companion, but this mini-arc remains one of my favorites in the new series, and it's wrapped up, for the time being at least, brilliantly. On the whole, while it may not be the Cybermen's best origin story, it's a really solid introduction that I've always had a soft spot for, so it's going to be yet another 8 out of 10. The Idiot's Lantern is just kind of boring. Normally, I'm a fan of historical stories, and the concept of an alien being taking advantage of the high sales of television in anticipation of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation sounds like an interesting pitch. In execution, though, there's a mildly interesting mystery and a couple of charming scenes as the Doctor completely takes control of the situation, but there just isn't much substance to any of it. The Wire makes for a fine villain for the most part, but her declarations of hungry do start to get on the nerves after a while. The episode also ends on what's played as a heartfelt and uplifting moment, with Rose encouraging Tommy to maintain a relationship with his father, which just comes across as icky when you remember this man is abusive and shows zero redeeming qualities over the course of the episode. Nice. But really, this is the prime example of the phrase, nothing burger. The Idiot's Lantern just kind of exists. It's got a couple of neat things, a couple annoying things, and that's about that, so I'll be giving it a 6 out of 10. While I've enjoyed a lot of this season so far, there's not a lot that I've loved. The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit changes that, being not just an excellent story in its own right, but one of the very best in the show's history. A big part of that is down to atmosphere, which the story absolutely nails. The design of Sanctuary Base 6 is superb, with the rusty metal and industrial vibe really enhancing the feeling of being far away from any safety and comfort, made even more menacing by being trapped on a planet orbiting a black hole. A fantastic visual, by the way. Murray Gold's score is also wonderfully evocative, perfectly capturing the feeling of unease and a history beyond our understanding. We get moments like the possessed Toby standing completely unprotected on the planet's surface, beckoning to Scooty as she gets sucked out to her death, making for one of the show's most hauntingly memorable moments. And speaking of the crew members, the show isn't always successful at making its supporting cast stand out, but man, if this isn't one of the most real-feeling bunch of people the Doctor's ever encountered. It's excellent character work, and there's a genuine sense of sorrow when they start dying, only slightly marred by a smattering of red shirts who receive none of that attention, which does break the immersion a bit, if only briefly. The story also introduces the Ood, one of the new series' most iconic creations. Their design is an instant classic, and they're terrifying as the beast possesses them as its foot soldiers. But they're sympathetic too, not only as victims of the beast, but their morally dubious position in society is ripe for exploration, something that will thankfully be expanded upon in a couple seasons' time. The beast itself is incredibly terrifying, and I love that its very existence forces the Doctor to confront his own assumptions and rules about the universe. It's quite a refreshing approach and a satisfying examination of what keeps the Doctor going. And while I'm not the biggest fan of the 10th Doctor and Rose's relationship, I do appreciate their dedication to one another. In a story that challenges their faith and beliefs, it only solidifies how much they can rely on each other. All in all, The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit is a wonderfully atmospheric adventure that keeps you on the edge of your seat, filled to the brim with great character work and fascinating concepts. A very easy 9 out of 10. Love and Monsters is one of the show's most infamous episodes, and it's easy to see why. For one thing, it's a massive departure from what we normally see in Doctor Who. This is a story that barely features the Doctor, instead focusing on a set of brand new characters and told with a heavy dose of direct-to-camera narration. In theory, I think this idea has a lot of potential, and some of that does come through. Elton Pope's a decent character, and while the narrated sections can feel a bit slow at points, it is genuinely interesting to see the Doctor from a different point of view. In particular, this story does some brilliant work with Jackie, as Elton tries to get closer to her to find out more about the Doctor, only to end up forming a genuine connection, until Jackie discovers his underlying motives and she stands up to him. It's a great examination of how the Doctor can affect the lives of those who don't travel with him, and is one of the most interesting storylines of the season. Unfortunately for Love and Monsters, this aspect only takes up a portion of the runtime, with a large part dedicated to Victor Kennedy, aka the Absorbaloff. This guy is, goofy, and not in a good way. To be honest, I find it hard to take him seriously even in his human persona, and I actually like the design of the Absorbaloff itself. It's just the weird loincloth and his silly run that completely kills any menace he might have. And then the episode ends on a really weird note, as the Doctor is able to partially rescue Elton's love interest from her absorption, who now gets to spend the rest of her days as a paving slab, topped off with the immortal line, "We even have a bit of a love life." Yikes. Look, I don't think this episode is as bad as fandom says, and there is some genuinely great stuff in here, but I can see why it turns a lot of people off, and it's not one I want to revisit often. So, Love and Monsters is going to be getting a 6.5 out of 10 from me. I was dreading this on my rewatch. Fear Her does not exactly have a stellar reputation, and while I admit it wasn't as bad as I remembered, it's still pretty bad. There are a couple of big issues here. Firstly, the idea of capturing living things as drawings, and vice versa drawings coming to life, has a lot of potential, but there clearly wasn't the budget to do anything all that interesting with it. I actually really like the idea of the scribble monster, but the rules of what gets brought to life and what doesn't, and indeed why they get brought to life, notably the drawing of Chloe's dad only gains life intermittently, is never really made clear. I think the story would have benefited from just focusing on the capturing aspect, which the show could achieve a bit more feasibly on its budget, and gives the opportunity to explore the themes of loneliness in more depth. And speaking of Chloe's dad, oh boy, it is impossible to take him seriously. And I don't just mean because it's a drawing. The way it's shot and the voice acting is distinctly unthreatening too. Which is bad enough for your main monster, but when that monster is meant to represent such a serious subject matter, yeah, Series 2 is not doing a good job with its handling of abusive parents. The Doctor and Rose's relationship also really gets on my nerves throughout the episode, despite a couple of good moments, and that resolution with the Olympic torch is one of the cheesiest things I have ever seen. Also, it might be because she's been lumbered with this really awkward whispering voice, but I find it really challenging to engage with the kid's performance as Chloe, which isn't great when it's the central part of the episode. In terms of things I did like, the moment where the Doctor gets drawn and disappears is genuinely brilliant, and I think Trish is a good character. There are also a couple of genuinely funny moments, but it's not a lot, so while it's a marginal improvement on the version I remembered, it's still not going to be getting any higher than a 3 out of 10 from me. Well, this season has been a bit of a bumpy ride, but I'm glad to say that the finale doesn't disappoint. Army of Ghosts and Doomsday is a pretty full story, paying off the season arc of Torchwood, providing a sequel to the mid-series alternative universe tale, wrapping up Rose's story, for now anyway, and even throwing in the Daleks for good measure. For the most part, I think the story handles the balance of these things pretty well, with each aspect getting a decent share of the runtime and a satisfying payoff. Let's start with Torchwood, which hasn't really affected most of the season's stories, but even still, I like that it's the direct consequence of one of the Doctor and Rose's earlier adventures. There's a real weight to having what's otherwise a throwaway adventure having major consequences later down the line. And the idea of Torchwood itself is a great fit for the Doctor Who universe. They defend the Earth, sure, but their methods are the total antithesis of the Doctor, and it's great seeing him forced to work alongside them, whilst also battling their authority. The mystery of the ghosts in Part 1 is also fascinating, with the reveal that they're actually Cybermen crossing over from the parallel world being incredibly satisfying. But even more than that, I love that this story brings back Mickey and Pete. It's hugely exciting to see the former pop up again as events come to a head, and the latter reuniting with our universe's Jackie, both of whom lost their own universe's spouse, is one of my favorite moments of the entire era. The fact that they both know they're not the same people that they lost, but the fact that their love transcends that anyway, is really powerful for me. It also helps bring things full circle with Rose, who, in the end, must depart the Doctor, but finally has a dad back in her life. I love this ending. The way the Doctor is the one to initially send her back to the other universe, because he knows how important it is for Rose to stick by her family, is heartbreaking, and the iconic imagery of the wall separating them remains just as impactful today as it did on first watch. The one thing I do take issue with is the whole "this is the story of how I died" shtick. I hate that. It's false drama and just feels cheap. The ending you went with is powerful on its own, let it speak for itself. Let's also briefly talk about the Daleks. The ideas of the Void Ship and the Cult of Skaro are great, even if they're kind of overshadowed by everything else going on. However, I do think this is one of the Daleks' weaker appearances in the new series. Their banter with the Cybermen is amusing, but does feel a little too much like dialogue, and I don't enjoy it nearly as much as I did when I was a kid. Same with the actual battle between the Daleks and the Cybermen. It's fun enough, but I feel like it's kind of lost its impact over the years in a way the other aspects of the finale haven't. So yeah, the Daleks are fine, and I don't dislike that they're here, but they're definitely a weak point. On the whole though, I do think this is a pretty strong finale. Certainly not perfect, and definitely a step down from Series 1's, but I still feel it concluded this season on a high, so I'll be giving it an 8 out of 10. Unfortunately, after how good Series 1 was, this just doesn't live up to it at all. It's certainly not without its highlights, but Series 2 is a much more rocky experience for me, both in terms of the episodes and the overarching elements. I mean, I like what we got with Torchwood, but it's nowhere near as effective as Bad Wolf, and as for the 10th Doctor and Rose, unfortunately, I just don't really click with their dynamic at all. The romance aspect is played up a little too much for my liking, and I also feel like the characters bring out the most annoying traits from each other. In my opinion, Rose was significantly better with the 9th Doctor, and the 10th Doctor becomes significantly better without Rose. However, the use of recurring characters continues to be a huge success. Mickey, Jackie, and Pete are all used to excellent effect throughout the season, and it ultimately comes together in a satisfying conclusion to threads that have been running since the start of the new series. So I would say that Series 2 still works fairly well as part of a larger story, but in and of itself, I'm unlikely to revisit it on its own merits outside of a select few stories. But before we wrap things up, let's add Series 2 to our ongoing new series statistics. Firstly, how would I rank the stories from this season? At the top is The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit, with a 9 out of 10, followed by The Girl in the Fireplace, Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel, Army of Ghosts and Doomsday, and School Reunion, all with 8 out of 10, The Christmas Invasion with 7.5 out of 10, Tooth and Claw with 7 out of 10, Love and Monsters with 6.5 out of 10, The Idiot's Lantern with 6 out of 10, New Earth with 4 out of 10, and finally Fear Her with 3 out of 10. Altogether, Series 2 obtains an average score of 6.75 out of 10. Although, just to note, I won't be taking specials into account for the season average, just episodes that aired between the premiere and the finale. This unfortunately drops the average score of the 2000s, and by extension Russell T Davies' time as showrunner, to 7.45 out of 10, while David Tennant enters the Doctor ranking with an average of 6.81. In terms of writers, Matt Jones joins the list in second with a 9 out of 10, Stephen Moffat moves down to fourth with a new average of 8.5, Tom McRae and Toby Whithouse are in fifth and sixth, each with an 8 out of 10, Russell T Davies drops down to 7th with a new average of 7.18, Mark Gatiss follows in 8th with a new average of 6.75, and Matthew Graham joins in 9th with a 3 out of 10. For directors, James Strong enters the list in 1st with a 9 out of 10, followed by Graham Harper in 3rd with an 8 out of 10. James Hawes moves down to 5th with a new average of 7.13. Euros Lynn moves down to 6th with a new average of 6.58, and Dan Zeff joins in 7th with a 6.5. In terms of premieres, New Earth joins below Rose, bringing the premiere average down to a 6 out of 10, while Army of Ghosts and Doomsday enters the finale list behind Bad Wolf and The Parting of the Ways, bringing the finale average down to 8.5. The Christmas Invasion starts off our specials ranking with 7.5 and joins the Doctor debut ranking in 2nd place. Finally, Series 2 gives us enough stories to make a top and bottom 10, and at this point they currently stand as Dalek, The Empty Child and the Doctor Dances, The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit, Bad Wolf and the Parting of the Ways, Father's Day, The Girl in the Fireplace, Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel, Army of Ghosts and Doomsday, School Reunion, and The End of the World for the top 10, and The Christmas Invasion, Aliens of London in World War III, The Unquiet Dead, Boomtown, Tooth and Claw, Love and Monsters, The Long Game, The Idiot's Lantern, New Earth, and Fear Her for the bottom 10. And those are my thoughts on Series 2. An inconsistent journey that has some good bits, but fails to live up to the standard of Series 1. But what do you think? Agree with my assessment? Do you think it deserves more love? Let me know in the comments below. And with that, Murgaman4 over and out, and I'll see you guys later.